Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the 2020 Childbright Summer Learning Series. Today, we are excited to welcome Dr. Gail Teachman, who is a previous recipient of our Training Innovation Fund Award, where the project that she's currently working on is focused on developing a model for meaningfully and ethically engaging youth with diverse disabilities as collaborators in a project. During this presentation, Gail will contextualize some of the benefits and potential unintended harms associated with patient engagement efforts that target youth, and of course discuss the approach that they're using in their project to invite youth input. Now, before we get started, I just want to cover some basic housekeeping items to ensure that the session today runs smoothly. And really what that comes down to is just me reminding you to please be sure to ensure that your microphone is muted and that your cameras are turned off. The combination of this just really helps reduce background noise and limits the bandwidth impacts that you may experience. So together, hopefully that allows for a smoother viewing experience on your end. Because without luck, we always seem to have some sort of technical glitch, but hopefully with that in place, it will go a lot smoother on everyone's end. Now, throughout the presentation today, there are going to be some opportunities for you to engage with Gail and provide some input. Now, to do that, we have two options for you. You can either toggle the chat feature and just input your thoughts via text there. We'll then read through those questions and get Gail's comments on them. Alternatively, if you wanted to just chime in over audio, we ask that you just indicate that you are interested in doing so by navigating to the participants panel and just sort of hitting that thumbs up button. We'll then be able to see that on our end and then prompt you to unmute yourself and take it away. So without further ado, I'll hand over the virtual podium to Gail. So Gail, take it away.
I wanted to begin by saying thanks for the opportunity to speak to these issues today. Thanks for the invitation to do the webinar, and for those of you that joined, I appreciate your time and interest, and I hope that we can have at least some time for discussion today. I wanted to just begin by giving a little bit of the context to both the study and to my own involvement. Excuse me. So I'm an occupational therapist by background. I've worked for many years in children's rehabilitation, both in the United States and in Canada. However, mostly at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital in Toronto. Currently, I'm an assistant professor at Western University's School of Occupational Therapy, as I shifted a few years ago from doing primarily clinical work into gradually doing more and more research. My interest in patient engagement grew from the recognition during my clinical work of just how much I was learning from the young people and families that I worked with. And I'm quite confident that most healthcare professionals would really heartily agree with that statement. For example, I became keenly aware of the ways that some of the recommendations and interventions that I was promoting were actually a poor fit with the real-world lives of the young people and families that I served. Over time, and especially once I became more involved in research, I became more and more interested in learning from young people and their families about how they made sense of and learned to live with chronic illness, impairment, and disability. But I had and continue to have a lot of questions about how to design and conduct patient-oriented research. What would be involved in working with young people, not as participants, but as partners in research? So I felt that one way to address those questions would be to learn through doing together, by partnering with young people in a specific research project and asking them how they felt that partnership should work. What felt right and fair? What was uncomfortable? Did they feel their contributions were valued and made a difference to the research project? So we applied for funding, and as you've heard, the project was funded by Childbright and is underway. So having provided that context, I wanted to go on and provide a brief overview of what we're going to cover in this webinar. I'd like to start by giving you, I've given you some context and background, but going on now to really focus the first part of this webinar on asking questions. Certainly, as I said, I've had a lot of questions. I still have more questions than answers. But now that we are working through this project, I hope that we will be able to begin answering at least some of those. Then I'd like to talk a bit about our project in progress and give you a little bit of a view into the sorts of activities we're doing, and then finish with some time for us to have further dialogue together today. So to begin, here's one of the places where we wanted to take advantage of the chat feature. I wondered if some of you might feel comfortable to write a very brief answer, or if you wanted to, you could, as Pierre said, you could indicate that you'd like to speak on your mic. Give us an idea of what you think patient engagement is. There's no right answer for sure. Just going to give it a few minutes in case anyone would like to contribute some thoughts. I see Frank Gowan asks a question that sums up this presentation, what it is or what it should be. Katie writes, including patients in research that's regarding them. Tom comments, nothing about us without us. And you'll see I speak to that a little bit later. So again, from Diane, working together with youth and families. Tasha comments, a partnership with patients to ask research questions that they want answered, not what is assumed by the researchers. Patient engagement avoids ready, shoot, aim. Just wait for maybe one or two more and then we'll move along. As I said, I partly wanted to ask this question because there's definitely no agreement. There are no set definitions of what patient engagement is, and in some ways that allows for open space for us to think about what it should be, but it also sometimes is limiting because as we talk about patient engagement, there isn't always agreement. So there's another comment from Frank, it needs to be bi-directional. So I'm going to carry on and we'll see what some other people have said about what is patient engagement. Here are a couple of definitions. From the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement, we hear patient engagement involves initiatives that engage patients and families in designing, delivering, and evaluating health services with the goal of improving the quality of care. Health Quality Ontario defines this as patients, families, and health providers actively collaborating in improving Ontario's health system. So there was a bit of a hint of this in one or two of the comments. Are we guilty of idealizing patient engagement, given that the intentions behind patient engagement would be seen primarily as good or right? Are there ways that we are idealizing patient engagement before we really figure out what it is, how to do it, and whether or not there are some other perspectives on patient engagement that may not be always good? Here are a couple of excerpts from research papers that took a somewhat more critical approach to thinking about patient engagement. I want to emphasize that these are not necessarily scholars who are against the project of patient engagement, but they are interested in encouraging us to think more deeply about what we mean when we talk about patient engagement. So in governance, Tritter and colleagues writes, user involvement is presented as initiating a constructive dialogue aimed at reshaping the relationship between patients, healthcare professionals, and the public, and as a catalyst to more widespread cultural change. For me, one of the things most interesting about that excerpt is the focus on reshaping the relationship. And what would that mean? Madden and Speed write that patient engagement in research involves a range of activities that enable patients and the public to have a say in decisions about the way health research is planned, designed, delivered, developed, evaluated, managed, and regulated. It also means where patients and the public are actively involved in the conduct of research studies. So again, these scholars are talking about what we hope for and what we aim for, I think, in terms of patient engagement. But they do point out that there are hazards along the way that we may want to think about. So further on in the article by Madden and Speed, they offer a more critical or cautionary definition of patient engagement, saying an institutional response, it could be an institutional response designed to address a legitimacy crisis, to bolster managerial power and/or satisfy external pressures through tokenistic practices of engagement. And I think many of us who have been involved to any extent with patient engagement are aware that there are these risks that the activities can take on a tokenistic symbolism, a type of experience on the part of patients who are engaged that they're not sure how much what their involvement, or they're not sure that their involvement is actually creating a difference or that it's creating consequential types of changes. So it's something for us to be watching for. So then why would we critique? Here I'm playing with the words a bit, but why critique both the idea and perhaps the ideal of patient engagement? Here are at least some points, certainly not a clear list, but we don't have answers to some of these fundamental questions like, what is the problem for which patient engagement is the answer? Again, I'm sure if we opened the chat, there would be many comments that we could all generate about what we think might be that problem. But in some cases, in specific instances of patient engagement, perhaps we could and should be more clear about what problem is specifically being addressed. Even things like what really counts as patient engagement. I've had experience where some people talk about patient engagement in the same way that they talk about patients participating in a research project as a participant, and the two become a bit conflated, and it's hard to know with any clarity what people are talking about. What are the specific aims? It seems important for all of the parties involved to know what are the outcomes, what are the aims that the group is working toward. What are the terms of engagement? And I'll say a little bit more about that, since that's one of the things we're particularly interested in our project. But here I've ended by asking a couple of questions. So have we put the cart before the horse? I think because for the most part, the idea of nothing about us without us is highly valued. And also because patient involvement has become mandated in some aspects of research and governance. We've gone ahead with all sorts of strategies for patient engagement without necessarily knowing how we might evaluate those initiatives. How can we know whether it's working well? How can we know where adjustments are needed? And what is at stake for the various stakeholders who are involved? So again, many scholars have been tackling these issues. There's quite a large body of literature in research looking at these issues. Here's a local researcher who's done some lovely work, Paula Rowland. And in this paper, she and her colleagues are asking in particular, what is the patient perspective in patient engagement programs? Here they're asking about what it is meant when sometimes people talk about the patient perspective as if there was one particular perspective that could be condensed from all of what people might say. And certainly they call for these types of careful and deep thinking about what patient engagement is, saying given the time, commitment, and generosity involved in patient engagement efforts in organizations, we suggest that there's an ethical obligation to give these programs such careful thought. And I've put at the bottom of this slide one of my favorite quotes because it gets across the idea that knowledge is always located in a particular position. We all come at patient engagement, as an example, from different social positions, perhaps as a patient, a parent of a patient, a healthcare professional, a manager. And we all have different perspectives and different ways of knowing that might be based on our training, might be based on our lived experience. But here this quote tells us that every way of knowing contains its own moral trajectory. We don't have time to unpack this in great depth, but the reason I like this quote is it helps us to think about how there are always values that are embedded in the ways that we understand knowledge. We all always come from a particular set of values when we think about knowledge, and I would argue we do the same when we think about patient engagement. Here I have another couple of quotes just to give a bit of a sense of what might be out there in the way of concerns that are being expressed about some aspects of patient engagement. There's a beautiful body of work that's been forwarded by a woman, Zsuzsanna Waronka. She has spent many years being involved as an engaged patient in the world of mental health in Canada. However, over time, she talks about how she became more and more concerned about what was happening to the narrative that she was sharing and how her knowledge and her sharing was potentially being taken up as a commodity. So I'll just take a minute these are a couple of excerpts from one of the papers that she has written. Negotiating the authority of lived experience within collaborative research is a difficult, exhausting, and complicated exchange, and often results in only small inroads. My body, representing inclusion, diversity, and difference at the table, further legitimizes such research projects as inclusionary, diversified, and participatory. So again, there's a thread there of concern about the potential for tokenism. Further, she goes on to say, as we, in this case, she's speaking both from her perspective as someone who has lived experience of mental health issues, but also someone who has been on the other side of the table because she has worked recruiting people to be patient engaged advisors. As we work to privilege lived experience as a commodity that can translate into inclusion within folds of power, we also have to think through our own agency, complicity, conflicts, and productivity within such ventures. So there's a lot in these quotes. And again, I would encourage anyone with interest to take a look at the work of some of these scholars. But again, what I want to emphasize here is how much the notion of values and power is beginning to come out in some of the concerns about how we all need to think about our own position and what we have to gain, the ways that we might benefit from being engaged with patient engagement. Here are just some of the critical questions that these papers and other work leads to. Whose initiative is it? What's being achieved and who benefits? What are the risks and potential harms of patient engagement? If we think about whose initiative, we do need to ask ourselves, so who invites whom? Who sets the agenda? Who frames the questions? And we saw some of this in your comments about perhaps what patient engagement can and should be. Who makes decisions? Who sets the terms? Whose rules and whose turf? So again, as I said at the beginning, this is not a discussion about answering all these questions, but rather taking a step back and asking some of these difficult questions for us all to continue to think about and work through. So patient engagement, what are the benefits and could there be potential harms? I'd like to start by thinking about what is being achieved and who benefits. And here I wondered, again, if you feel comfortable, if anyone would like to put something in chat about the kinds of benefits that you perceive being important about patient engagement. Remembering that, as I said, this isn't a presentation that is about suggesting that we get rid of the project of patient engagement. On the contrary, it's about how can we learn to do it better? How can we learn to do it well? Just gonna wait a minute in case anyone has thoughts about what are some of the important benefits. So Pierre suggests research outputs that are more directly applicable to patient needs. And from Frank, it makes some people feel good. Diane comments, we learn what truly is important to families. And yes, when I met with the Youth Advisory Council at Holland Bloorview prior to framing this research program to find out what they thought was important. And one of the comments from one of the young advisors was, yes, I think that this would be a project that we're interested in because we don't really get asked very often what we worry about. From Jenny, improving relationships and collaboration between families, patients, and clinicians. Tom suggests possibly cost savings associated with fewer false starts on product research. A chance to be surprised, challenge our assumptions, from Laura. Thanks for that. I think I'll move along. And I think we all agree that there are benefits. I think some of the questions I'm asking on this slide are meant to prompt us to think a little bit more about how can we be more precise about what the benefits are that we're looking for. And if we know what those are, can we find ways to measure or to in some way find a way to assess whether we have achieved those aims? I think in any presentation about patient engagement, I would be remiss to not point out how much information and knowledge is available that isn't necessarily contained behind firewalls in peer-reviewed literature. There's a real wealth of information that I would encourage anyone not familiar with it to look to in websites, magazines, and all sorts of what academics might call gray literature, where people that have been involved in patient engagement activities can get together and share, support one another, but also talk about the kinds of things that they would like to help institutions understand about what not to do. So it's not in this slide, but I have seen the hashtag how not to engage patients going along with how to engage patients. So these are really important sites for most of us to have a look at if we're interested in patient engagement and begin to learn what are some of the issues being brought forward about the difference between perhaps the aims and intentions of patient engagement and potential areas where the activities end up falling a bit short of those aims. So here is by far not a complete list, perhaps a list that we could argue about in a collegial way. These are some of the potential risks that I can think of or that people I've worked with have brought forward. One is the notion of virtue signaling. This is a term that can be used to indicate that perhaps unintentionally still, some patient engagement might be happening in order for an institution to appear to be interested in what patients are saying, and because it is the right thing to do. However, not with a lot of thought, not with a lot of real deep intention in terms of the specific problems and aims of particular patient engagement activities. there are concerns about whether or not people involved in patient engagement as patients are providing free ideas and are expected to do all of this just based on their own goodwill. What if the movement for patient engagement were to replace some of the market or other types of customer research that can inform both institutions in terms of governance and research? Do we need to be concerned at all that patient activities might end up somehow silencing or managing complaints, and that processes for patients to bring forward individual specific concerns might be less available? Is there a risk that patient engagement activities end up in some way influencing people to come on board with organizational goals, as opposed to potentially hanging on to some of the agendas for change that might be the reason that they engaged in the activities in the first place? I think we need to at least be watchful for the illusion that patient engagement activities are actually influencing consequential change, the illusion that there might be equitable outcomes. We can ask ourselves, for example, what are the benefits to people who, from a patient perspective, become involved in patient engagement? And finally, what about issues of representation, which is a very large discussion. Again, we won't have time for today, but who is involved and who is not involved in patient engagement activities? And how does that influence the knowledge that is being produced? Again, here are some potential ethics and equity questions, but of course there would be many more. And some of these overlap with other points I've made earlier. But who has the ownership and oversight? How are the outcomes of patient engagement measured? Is the process evaluated? Do institutions have responsibilities for engaged patients? Are there protections in place? Is there a complaints process for patient engagement activities? And how transparent is the patient engagement process? And last, I won't read all the comments on this slide, but we begin to look at how some of these operational questions have been coming forward. And I want to point out in particular the list on the right in terms of what might be some of the terms under which people become engaged in patient engagement. So again, accountability, what sorts of communications, where would it happen and how often? What about these challenging issues of recruitment and selection, training and facilitation? One that many people think about is what sort of remuneration should be offered? And what about retention, continuity, and the sustainability of these activities? So again, as I started out, I wanted to look at how can we study patient engagement and learn more about some of these issues. And so, as I mentioned, we developed a project and actually have since expanded that project, where in our context, we're looking specifically at patient engagement within children's rehabilitation, and in particular at youth engagement. While we initially were looking at just youth involvement in research, and that's certainly a big focus, we have since expanded and are also looking at learning about youth experiences in governance activities, which involves things like sitting on institutional committees, perhaps a health and safety committee, or some kind of quality improvement committee. Those are just examples. So this is the project that was funded through ChildBright, excuse me. And we aim to develop a partnership model for collaborative research with youth with disabilities. One of the things I want to mention here that goes right to the heart of what our aims are is what to do about this terminology. Some young people might prefer person-first language, so young person with disabilities. But some people prefer perspectives that are usually coming from critical disability studies or the social model of disability, where we might use language such as disabled youth. And the reason for that is that a social model approach to look at disability suggests that disability is not located within an individual, but rather is the result of societal stigma, prejudice, and disadvantage over time. But last, and I don't want to leave it out, we didn't want to assume that all of the young people involved in our study necessarily take up an identity with disability. In fact, to be included in our study, young people need to have had experience with treatment of some sort within a children's rehabilitation centre in Ontario. And so I'm putting it out there just to point out that even at the level of language, there are lots of issues when we undertake patient engagement that we want to be mindful of and learn about through this research. So we're asking young people in the study about these kinds of terminology, what they prefer, and why, because those things also say a lot about values. This is the team working in the project. Our initial project included Bhavnita Mistry, Barbara Gibson, and Yanni Hamdani. As we expanded the project to look at governance, we've been happy to have Dr. Franco Carnevale on board, and some of you will know him. He is also quite involved with Child Right, and he's working with us from McGill University. And certainly important to point out, our team absolutely includes the young people who are working with us as participant collaborators. To date, we've just recruited 2 young people, and we're looking forward to recruiting several more. The study itself has 2 key aims. The first aim is, as I mentioned at the beginning, to learn by doing together. So we needed to think about what would be that project that we would do together. So we aim to partner with young people to develop training modules for healthcare professionals that build on results from a study led by Dr. Gibson, who was focused on balancing medical and human aspects of care. So I'll say a little bit more in a minute about what that means, human aspects of care. In tandem with that study aim, we wanted to examine in depth the range of ethical challenges that might arise in relation to fostering what we hoped would be meaningful and consequential research and governance partnerships with young people who've been involved with children's rehab. So what are these human aspects of care? Here I'm showing you a set of cards that was developed as one innovative way to share the results of the research beyond simply peer-reviewed papers. Using this set of cards, young people or healthcare professionals can work on some self-guided reflection or discussion based on what the research showed about some of the human aspects of care that might sometimes be neglected or might be set aside in lieu of privileging the medical aspects of care that are typically provided in children's rehabilitation. So we won't go into them in depth, but I just want to point out here, I've highlighted one, diversity inclusion, because I'm going to use that to show an example later of what we're doing in the training modules together with young people. In brief, the methodology of the study will involve 8 to 10 young people, 13 to 28 years old, who have experienced receiving children's rehab services. They'll engage with us as partners, participants, and collaborators. We're engaging through a series of individual and group dialogues, which were originally, of course, planned to be in person, but we have shifted to doing most of this work online. We hope that we might one day be able to do some aspects of the project in person, but we'll all have to see how that works out. We will together pilot test the training modules with healthcare professional students and clinicians, and then further refine those training modules with our participant collaborators. So with study aim 2, while developing the training modules, we also will be engaging in dialogues and journaling, all of the team members, in order to generate knowledge about what we're learning. What are the ethical implications that are occurring to us in the relations during the research process? For example, what are the perceived benefits? What might be some unintentional harms, issues of representation, power, or other concerns that might arise? So we're bringing together the 2 parts of the study in tandem. Now I wanted to say a little bit more about, so what are these training modules? It's sort of an abstract idea. So I'm going to spend a few minutes showing you just a little bit of some very basic starter modules. These are, you could think of them as a shell that some of us on the team developed in order to have a place to begin in terms of our discussions with the youth involved in the study. So one example of the human aspects of care would be to expand our thinking about what we mean by diversity and inclusion. And to do that, we wanted to consider what are the ways that medical ways of thinking about disability might also shape our thinking about diversity and inclusion as healthcare professionals. So in one of the training modules, we start by talking about everyday assumptions. So this is just a title slide for part of one of the training modules in development. We start with some learning objectives, which again, I won't go into in great depth, but again, these are targeted learning modules for healthcare professionals to think again about some of the ways, some of the assumptions that are embedded in our training to practice in children's rehabilitation. So we talk about, well, what are everyday assumptions? What are some of the things that we hold to be natural or that just seem to be true? And point out that these reflect the ways we make sense of the world. It's not about identifying wrong assumptions, but pointing out what are some of the socially agreed upon ways that we think about concepts such as disability and how that influences our actions. So we use this example about fish in water, and some of you might know this kind of metaphor about how we're all immersed in particular ways of thinking about, say, children's rehab or disability, to the extent that it can be very difficult for us to think any other way, or to recognize that there are wholly different ways of thinking about these objects. We also try to get across the point that assumptions do change over time. It's possible to make change and to shift some of these very strong, socially agreed upon notions. So we use this somewhat more humorous slide and encourage discussion and just rethinking in the training module about how certain kinds of ways of thinking change over time. And here there's this lovely chart comparing things that used to be thought about as just what old people did, but now are considered very hip. Here we ask, again, in a training module for people to take a look first at this one image, and then a second, and then put them together. And here again, remember, we're thinking about assumptions. We're asking people to think about the quick judgments that we make in practice, and also the ways in which what we see is very much influenced by these kinds of social assumptions. And similarly here, we ask people to take a quick look, but then we look closer and see that on the wall are not images of insects, but rather elaborate photos of vehicles taken from above. And these are excerpts from quite a popular ad campaign on the part of Jeep brand. So again, I'm still in the training module. Then we would be encouraging some discussion about assumptions, thinking about what sorts of assumptions underpin practice in children's rehab, and how these things help us to shape our ideas about what is right or what is common sense and take those things for granted. Go a little further here and think about in children's rehab, what are some of these assumptions about disability? And again, these are not necessarily ideas that all of you listening today would agree on. I think they are quite common in the context of children's rehabilitation in some of the training that most of us have had. So we tend to assume that functioning as close to normal as possible will be preferred, and that increasing physical function will translate to an enhanced quality of life, or that independence is ideal and preferred. So again, I want to emphasize, these are not ideas that were created within children's rehab. These are ideas that dominate our society at large, and they're taken up both in medicine and within the field of children's rehabilitation. And they tend to very much shape what we do, not only as healthcare professionals, but also in terms of what the families and young people that we work with are interested in, because again, we're all immersed in these same sorts of ideas. But sometimes these ideas can have unintended effects. Here we see how common this notion of getting back to normal is. It tends to be quite pervasive in many aspects of our society in all sorts of media. But there are problems with the idea of normal in terms of how we can think about the effects it may have for some of the young people and families we work with. Another way that this idea of normal is becoming even stronger is in the notion of so-called normal development, where most parents these days feel an inordinate pressure to be continually monitoring their child, to the extent that there are all sorts of apps that parents can download, which I would argue increase parental anxiety as opposed to decreasing anxiety. This is the beginning of a different module, and again, I'm just trying to give you a bit of an idea. Here we look at what is disability, and we compare some of the definitions. This is a definition from Rehab International, where we see some of this language about independence, full inclusion, and participation as an aim of rehabilitation. But here we begin to introduce different perspectives. So again, this idea that there are other ways of understanding disability, and that we need to know that many of the people that we work with may also take on this different set of values about disability. So here, a prominent disability studies scholar suggests disability is the complex interplay of body, environment, culture, and personal characteristics which serve to exclude certain people from becoming full participants in interpersonal, social, cultural, economic, and political affairs. So here again, you see that we're trying to introduce ways to rethink some core concepts so that we can then think about how these ways of thinking influence the people we work with. And in this module, we go further into thinking about whether disability is actually a thing or an idea, and pointing out how these sets of ideas lead to different actions and consequences, even when we're not aware of it. And instead, we introduce again a more affirmative idea where we can think about disability as an enduring potential to get us to think differently about the world at large. So again, that's just a very brief introduction to some of the modules, but they are just starting places. So now that we are working together with participant collaborators, what we're really emphasizing is what is missing from these modules is their perspectives, the content that they would like to be there, and what matters to them. So these modules that I've shown a few little bits from today may change drastically, but we felt we needed to develop something in order to move forward with having like some sort of a shell or a frame that we could ask young people to then help us build from. And again, the content of those modules is based on the previous research that's kind of grounding this aspect of human aspects of care. And our task now is to work together with participant collaborators. And at the same time, while we do that, back to our aim number 2, we're very interested in learning about their moral experiences throughout the process of collaborating or partnering with us. Again, just trying to give you more of an idea about the research itself, the way that we're hoping to capture or really generate this knowledge about ethical issues is through reflective dialogues and journaling on the part, again, of all of the team, not only the youth. So these are examples of the sorts of questions that we will regularly be thinking about, talking about, and journaling about in order to find a way for the young people involved in the study to comfortably share what works well for them, what feels fair and right, and what's not comfortable, what doesn't feel great, or what they think might not be beneficial to them in terms of their partnership with us. Again, I think these are sensitive topics, and we need to proceed carefully and with lots of respect and humility in terms of having these discussions, creating a safe space. That's starting to finish up some of the content that I had to share today. I really wanted to share that if you're interested in more information about patient engagement in general and some of the debates and really fascinating discussions that are going on, I would encourage you to listen to a new podcast. Again, this is being produced by local scholars, Jennifer Johannesson and Emily Nicholas Engel. It's a very engaging podcast. I know some people on the webinar today have had involvement, but it's just come out, and I think they're doing a wonderful job of promoting a really balanced, thoughtful discussion about patient engagement. Again, also because I can't resist as a researcher, if you are someone that you know would be interested in participating in our study, we are still recruiting. And I just wanted to let people know, if you're interested, you can find more details about our study. If you go to Hull and Bloorview's website, they have tabs called Participate in Research. And if you look for the name of our project, Development of a Partnership Model, you can find more information there for anyone that's interested in the study. And now I definitely want to just open up for any discussion or questions that people have, either with the chat function, or if you feel comfortable, you could put your thumb up, as Pierre said, and you could unmute your mic. I put my contact information here, and just before we do that, I'm going to just put up this slide saying thank you to our participant collaborators, but also wanted to acknowledge the real wonderful support that we have from all of these supporting partners. So I would welcome any discussion that you have, or questions, concerns. Are there parts of what I presented today that feel uncomfortable? I think these are the sorts of discussions that are important for us to have. I see a question from Frank. Between Pierre and I, we're going to handle some of these questions. I'm just taking a look at the time. We have about 10 minutes for those of you that are able to stay on. Frank asks, do you find that older youth, those in their mid-20s, dominate when grouped with much younger youth? Well, Frank, we do hope to do groups a bit later. We so far have just recruited 2 young people, and we're going to go with their comfort level. When they agreed to be part of the study, we did indicate that there would be an opportunity later for Zoom group chats or potentially in-person chats. And I think that will be something that we need to think about, is whether or not age and therefore experience of a particular young person might lead to some sort of imbalance in the group. But for now, I don't have an answer to that. Maybe I will just say, for some people, they might be surprised at the age range that I shared. There isn't really an agreed on definition of young person these days. Youth as a term sometimes is used up to 18, sometimes to 21. But actually in several ministerial definitions that we looked at, that age has been raised quite a bit to young persons up to 28. From Tasha, can you comment on any of the positive benefits you have experienced from including participant collaborators in the work you're doing? Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons that I am keen to learn more about how we can be ethically conducting this kind of research. But in other projects that I've been involved in, we have had youth collaborators in a slightly different arrangement, where perhaps there was just one or two young people that were in a bit of a consulting role, where we would perhaps, meet occasionally once every 2 or 3 months and provide some updates, but in particular take a look at, say, methodologies that we were using, and get their input on what might be working better, what were the ways that they felt young people might want to talk about the issues that they were mentioning. Actually, I've also had quite helpful input from young people in studies, even when I didn't solicit in one of the early projects that I did. I had wisely been told by another researcher to think about, at the end of an interview, asking young people about, so how was this and how did it feel and do you have suggestions? And in research that I did with quite young children, grades 1 to 4, several young people, when I asked that question, said, oh, I think that you should do this instead, or I was using various types of props and activities, and they had great suggestions about what I could do differently that really improved the research. So certainly I can see all sorts of benefits. Tom asks, how do you suggest that we obtain informed consent from non-speaking youth and include their input in our project? I haven't said much today about more of my specific background when I was working as an OT, but in fact I worked for quite a number of years in the area of augmentative and alternative communication. So one of the things that I felt well prepared to do and felt quite passionate about was this issue that you're asking about in terms of informed consent. I developed a tool that I called a visual consent framework, where we used augmentative strategies that are quite familiar to people who communicate in ways other than speech. So symbol sets or photographs, boards to construct sentences. We turned the information about the study into materials that were prepared in the mode that a young person used. So if they used picture symbols, we used picture symbols in the information about the study. And then together we constructed sentences where the young person could either indicate that they wanted to be part of a study, that they did not want to be, or that they had a question. And it was really exciting to move forward with that form of consent, because for me it was the first time with young people who communicate primarily in ways other than speech, where they were able to ask questions using the mode of communication that works best for them, to understand more about a study before they would give consent or not. And it also prompted opportunities for some young people to say, no, I don't want to be part of this research, whereas previously their parents thought that they did and were saying yes, but then given this opportunity through the visual framework, the young person indicated that no, in fact, I don't want to be part of the research. So I felt that that was extremely important, and I think you're asking or pointing out an issue that's important. Linda asks, what were some challenges that you experienced with participant collaborators, and how did you address these challenges? Again, I'm afraid I have to say we've only enrolled 2 people so far, so we're at the early stages with working together with them. I would say one of the things I shared earlier was this reflection on even what sort of language we use in the study came about through the first interview, where I realized all of a sudden that I wasn't asking, what sorts of terminology do you use, or do you think of yourself as someone with a disability? So I think that's a partial answer, and I expect that we will experience many more of those kinds of moments or challenges where we need to be really, really reflexive about the work we're doing and open to continually asking these kinds of questions of the young people that are working with us. Nicole asks, did you create a terms of engagement document for your patient partnerships, or do you hope to create that? And so the latter part of your question there is the case, yes. We hope to begin to draft something like that as part of the output of our study. I don't know that it will be complete from a study as small as this one, but I hope that as we move forward with the research, then we can be contributing. And of course, there are other people working on these sorts of things as well. So it's important that we put together what's being learned about this in order to try to come up with terms of engagement. Jen asks, so I'm curious to know how you plan to bring the young participant collaborators up to speed on some of the more challenging academic ideas put forward in the early draft of the modules. Or will you be starting from scratch in terms of asking them what they would like included? So I think it's fair to say, while we're open to going in completely different directions, we made a decision not to start from scratch. And as you saw, we developed basic modules. Now I know Jennifer knows about these modules because we have collaborated in other projects in the past. What we're doing is working through those modules slowly with lots of discussion to both, yes, get across what might be some of the academic ideas. Perhaps some of those ideas won't remain in the product that we end up creating. Maybe some will, but will have been modified or the language will be changed. But I think that that's part of my experience has been that in all research, both participant and researcher always come out changed at the other end of any particular project. We learn from each other. We learn to think differently about the concepts that we're working with. And particularly in this project, I can't help but think that the draft modules that we've developed will be changed. But more than that, our own ideas about what should be in these training modules will have shifted. And we hope we'll be including many more perspectives about what matters to the young people involved in the project, what would they most want to get across, given an opportunity to help develop training modules for healthcare professionals.
Wonderful, Gail. Thank you so much, and everyone for asking those great questions.
Yes, thank you.
If anything were to come to mind after the fact, feel free to email me. We'll get in touch with Gail and ask for her feedback on any other prompts. But thank you again for joining us on this first of our summer learning series webinars. And of course, a special thank you to Gail for giving us a great overview of some of the barriers and issues with patient engagement if it's not done well, and of course showcasing the work on that project that she is currently working on. So I'm sure I'm not the only one looking forward to seeing those modules developed, and it would be great to get an update of those along the line.
Yeah, they will eventually be on the ChildBright website somewhere. We look forward to that.
Yeah, that's one of the next steps, right? So that'd be great.
Definitely. Thank you all for great questions and discussion.
Yeah, wonderful. And then, yes, just to follow up on that, just a quick announcement. If you haven't signed up for our next session on July 21st, feel free to go to ChildBright's event page. But of course, we will be announcing a few other webinars throughout the summer, so please stay tuned. And if any of those interest you, do sign up. So thank you so much. Take care, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. Bye.
Thank you.